September 17, 1944. Wehrmacht Logistics Headquarters, Arnhem, Netherlands. Oberst Kurt Richter stood at his operations map watching reports arrive, describing an event that seemed impossible according to every principle of military logistics he had learned during 20 years of service. American and British transport aircraft were dropping entire divisions behind German lines, delivering thousands of paratroopers complete with artillery, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies sufficient for sustained independent operation. The Wehrmacht's scale exceeded anything German military doctrine considered feasible for airborne operation. Richter had studied airborne operations extensively, recognizing their tactical potential while understanding their severe logistics limitations. Paratroopers could seize tactical objectives through surprise, but required rapid ground link-up because they couldn't carry sufficient supplies for extended operations. German airborne doctrine emphasized quick strikes, followed by relief by conventional forces within 48 hours maximum. The idea of supplying entire divisions by air for sustained operations seemed logistically impossible. Yet, the intelligence reports were undeniable. Operation Market Garden involved dropping over 34,000 Allied paratroopers across 64 miles of occupied Netherlands, the largest airborne operation in history. American C-47 transport aircraft were delivering not just infantry, but also jeeps, artillery, pieces, anti-tank guns, ammunition, medical supplies, and rations sufficient for divisions to operate independently for days. The logistics coordination required to air deliver such massive quantities seemed to violate fundamental constraints on aerial supply capacity. The numbers were staggering even before considering the operational complexity. Over 1,500 transport aircraft and 500 gliders were employed in the initial lift alone, delivering troops and equipment in coordinated waves across multiple drop zones simultaneously. Subsequent resupply missions delivered hundreds of tons of additional supplies daily, maintaining division strength through aerial logistics that German planners considered theoretically impossible at such scales. Richter had calculated airlift requirements for theoretical German airborne operations, concluding that supplying even regimental-sized units by air exceeded practical feasibility. Each paratrooper required approximately 10 pounds of supplies daily, including ammunition, food, water, and medical materials. A division of 10,000 troops required 50 tons of supplies daily, translating to over 100 C-47 sorties, considering aircraft payload limitations and delivery inefficiencies. Sustaining operations for even a week required 700 successful resupply sorties under combat conditions. The operational challenges seemed insurmountable. Transport aircraft were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. Supply drops required precise coordination with ground forces to ensure delivery to correct location. Weather could prevent aerial resupply for days. Even successful drops lost 20–30% of supplies to dispersion, damage, or enemy capture. The cumulative inefficiencies suggested that aerial resupply could supplement but never replace conventional ground logistics for sustained operations. Yet Allied forces were demonstrating exactly such capabilities, operating airborne divisions deep behind German lines with logistical support delivered entirely by air. The psychological shock extended beyond operational surprise to fundamental recognition that Allied logistics capabilities exceeded anything German planning had considered possible. The transportation capacity, organizational coordination, and industrial resources required to support such operations suggested Allied logistical superiority of incomprehensible magnitude. The story of how German supply officers came to understand Allied aerial logistics capabilities isn't one of single dramatic revelation, but rather accumulated evidence, forcing recognition that Allied forces possessed transportation and supply capabilities that German logistics doctrine hadn't anticipated. The transformation from disbelief to horrified comprehension occurred gradually as intelligence officers compiled data, demonstrating systematic Allied advantages across every logistics dimension. The German military that entered World War II possessed what its officers considered sophisticated logistics, understanding based on railroad-centric supply systems supporting mobile operations. German logistics doctrine emphasized pre-positioned supplies, rapid railroad movement to forward depots, and efficient truck distribution to frontline units. The system worked effectively during Poland and France campaigns, where German forces advanced rapidly against opponents whose logistics infrastructure could be captured and exploited. The system's limitations became apparent during operations in the Soviet Union, where distances exceeded German logistics capacity and destroyed infrastructure prevented effective railroad utilization. German forces advanced faster than supply. Lines could follow, creating fuel and ammunition shortages that constrained operations. The logistics failures contributed to operational setbacks, but German planners attributed problems to unusual circumstances rather than fundamental doctrine deficiencies. German airborne operations during Crete in 1941 demonstrated both the tactical potential and logistics limitations of parachute forces. German paratroopers seized the island through daring operations but suffered heavy casualties, partly due to inadequate resupply. Transport aircraft delivering reinforcements and supplies were shot down or destroyed on landing, leaving paratroopers critically short of ammunition and heavy weapons. The operation succeeded, but convinced German planners that large-scale airborne operations were prohibitively expensive and logistically unsustainable. This assessment informed German assumptions about Allied airborne capabilities. German intelligence. New Allied forces were training paratroop divisions, but assumed they faced equivalent logistics constraints limiting their employment to small-scale tactical operations. The idea that Allies could supply entire divisions by air for sustained operations seemed impossible, given German understanding of airlift limitations and supply requirements. The first indications that Allied aerial logistics might exceed German assumptions appeared during the Sicily invasion in July 1943, where American and British airborne forces conducted drops supporting the amphibious assault. German defenders noted that Allied paratroopers operated with apparent supply adequacy, despite being isolated from conventional supply lines. Intelligence reports described aerial resupply operations delivering ammunition and equipment to scattered paratrooper units. The scale remained relatively modest during Sicily, consistent with German understanding of airborne operations as tactical auxiliaries rather than independently sustainable forces. However, the operational effectiveness of Allied paratroopers, despite isolation, suggested better logistics support than German doctrine predicted. The evidence was concerning but not yet horrifying, representing tactical adaptation rather than fundamental logistics revolution. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 provided more systematic evidence of Allied aerial logistics capabilities exceeding German planning assumptions. American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped inland from invasion beaches, seizing tactical objectives and disrupting German responses. What shocked German logistics officers was that these divisions operated effectively for days before ground link-up, suggesting supply adequacy that shouldn't have been possible for isolated airborne forces. Intelligence assessments of Allied paratroop operations during Normandy revealed systematic aerial resupply that maintained division effectiveness throughout sustained combat. Transport aircraft flew repeated missions delivering ammunition, medical, supplies, and rations directly to drop zones controlled by paratroopers. The resupply operations occurred despite German anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, demonstrating Allied willingness to accept aircraft losses to maintain airborne logistics. Oberst Richter personally investigated captured American supply containers recovered from Normandy drop zones, examining their contents and construction. The containers featured sophisticated packaging protecting supplies during parachute delivery. Ammunition arrived in padded crates that absorbed landing impacts without damage. Medical supplies were packaged in waterproof containers, preventing contamination. Rations came in compact, calorie-dense forms maximizing nutritional value per pound. The packaging quality suggested industrial systems specifically designed for aerial resupply rather than improvised solutions. American forces weren't adapting conventional supplies for air delivery. They were manufacturing specialized equipment optimized for parachute logistics from inception. This indicated systematic investment in aerial supply capabilities that German logistics doctrine hadn't anticipated or prepared to counter. More disturbing was the sheer volume of supplies Allied forces air-delivered during Normandy operations. German intelligence estimated that American airborne divisions received over 500 tons of supplies via aerial resupply during the first week after D-Day. This represented approximately 50 tons daily, matching theoretical requirements for division sustainment. Allied forces weren't just conducting tactical aerial resupply, they were operationally sustaining divisions through air logistics alone. The aircraft numbers required for such operations shocked German planners familiar with Luftwaffe transport limitations. Germany possessed approximately 500 Ju-52 transport aircraft in 1944, insufficient to support single airborne division for extended operations. Allied forces clearly operated transport fleets an order of magnitude larger, enabling logistics operations. German resources couldn't replicate American C-47 transport aircraft production statistics confirmed these fleet size estimates when intelligence obtained them through neutral sources. American factories had produced over 10,000 C-47s between 1941 and 1944, with thousands assigned to military airlift commands supporting global operations. The production scale represented industrial capacity differences that explained Allied aerial logistics capabilities. German forces couldn't match the operational coordination enabling large-scale aerial resupply operations revealed organizational sophistication exceeding German logistics systems. Allied forces operated aerial ports, coordinating hundreds of aircraft sorties daily, loading supplies according to standardized procedures, dispatching missions on precise schedules coordinated with ground forces, and tracking delivery success rates through systematic reporting. The industrial organization applied to military logistics created capabilities German more traditional systems never developed. German supply officers studying Allied logistics operations recognized they were witnessing systematic advantages extending beyond individual capabilities to comprehensive organizational superiority. Allied forces didn't just possess more aircraft. They operated integrated logistics systems, coordinating air and ground supply through standardized procedures, centralized planning, and systematic execution that German fragmented logistics commands couldn't replicate. The Rhine River crossing operations during early 1945 demonstrated Allied aerial logistics capabilities at maximum scale, providing definitive evidence that horrified German planners. Operation Varsity in March 1945 employed over 1,700 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders, delivering 2 complete airborne divisions, 17,000 troops with full equipment, across the Rhine in single day. The operation represented the largest single-day airborne deployment in history, exceeding even Market Garden in concentration, if not total numbers. What shocked German observers was the logistics follow-through. After initial delivery, Allied transport aircraft continued, flying resupply missions, maintaining the division's combat effectiveness for days. German forces, watching from defensive positions, reported continuous aerial supply operations with transport. Aircraft arriving in steady streams delivering supplies to marked drop zones. The logistics sustainment enabled airborne forces to maintain offensive operations without ground supply lines. Oberst Friedrich Müller, commanding German supply operations in the Rhine sector, watched Allied aerial logistics with professional disbelief. His own supply operations struggled to deliver sufficient ammunition and fuel to frontline units located 30 kilometers behind front lines using conventional truck transport. Allied forces were supplying divisions 50 kilometers beyond their lines using only aircraft, maintaining supply adequacy exceeding what German ground logistics achieved. The comparison was psychologically devastating. German logistics doctrine emphasized efficient ground transportation utilizing railroads, trucks, and pre-positioned depots. This approach worked when infrastructure remained intact and fuel was available. By 1945, Allied bombing had destroyed much German transportation infrastructure, while fuel shortages crippled remaining truck fleets. German supplies moved slowly and inadequately using methods German doctrine considered optimal. Allied aerial logistics bypassed destroyed infrastructure entirely, delivering supplies directly from distant air bases to frontline positions. Regardless of ground conditions, the capability rendered transportation, network, destruction strategically meaningless for Allied operations. While German forces remained dependent on vulnerable ground logistics, the asymmetry represented fundamental operational advantages German forces couldn't counter or replicate. The glider operations that supplemented parachute delivery demonstrated another dimension of Allied logistics innovation. American and British forces employed thousands of cargo gliders delivering vehicles, artillery, and heavy equipment that couldn't be parachuted effectively. Gliders could land intact carrying jeeps, anti-tank guns, and supply loads far exceeding what individual paratroopers could carry. The glider fleets provided aerial logistics, capabilities approaching conventional ground transport in payload capacity. German forces had experimented with cargo gliders, but never developed them systematically due to resource constraints and doctrinal skepticism about aerial logistics. The handful of German gliders produced were employed sparingly in special operations rather than integrated into standard logistics doctrine. Allied forces operated gliders as routine logistics assets, producing thousands and employing them in standard operations. The industrial capacity supporting Allied glider operations revealed production capabilities that German logistics officers found incomprehensible. American factories produced over 13,000 CG-4A Waco gliders between 1942 and 1945, plus thousands of additional variants. British factories produced similar numbers. The glider production represented industrial output devoted to what German planners considered specialized equipment of limited utility. Allied forces produced specialized logistics, equipment in quantities exceeding German production of standard military vehicles. The pilot training supporting Allied aerial logistics operations revealed organizational depth that explained operational capabilities. German forces observed but couldn't replicate. Transport aircraft operations required specialized skills, including formation flying, low-altitude navigation, and precision supply dropping. Allied forces trained thousands of transport pilots specifically for logistics missions, creating pilot pools dedicated to supply operations rather than combat roles. German pilot training prioritized combat aviation, with transport duties assigned to pilots medically unfit for fighter or bomber operations. The doctrinal emphasis reflected assumptions that transport flying required less skill and provided less military value than combat missions. Allied forces treated transport aviation as specialized profession, requiring dedicated training and professional development, creating pilot cadres whose expertise enabled complex logistics operations. The aircrew coordination required for successful supply drops demonstrated capabilities developed through systematic training. Transport pilots needed to coordinate with navigators identifying drop zones, load masters managing cargo deployment, and ground forces marking target areas. Successful drops required aircraft maintaining precise altitude and speed, while cargo specialists released supplies at exact moments, ensuring delivery to intended locations. The coordination complexity exceeded capabilities improvised training could produce. Allied transport crews trained extensively using standardized procedures practiced until execution became automatic. Pilots flew repeated training missions, perfecting formation approaches. Navigators practiced drop zone identification using landmarks and radio beacons. Loadmasters drilled cargo deployment procedures, ensuring safe parachute releases. The systematic training created crew proficiency, enabling consistent, successful supply delivery under combat conditions. German transport operations lacked equivalent systematic training, with crews learning through experience rather than formal instruction programs. The informal approach worked adequately for occasional transport missions, but couldn't produce proficiency levels required for sustained logistics operations under combat stress. Allied transport crews executed complex supply missions routinely that German crews would consider exceptionally demanding. The navigation systems supporting Allied supply operations revealed technological capabilities that enabled precision delivery German systems couldn't match. American transport aircraft employed radio navigation beacons allowing pilots to locate drop zones accurately despite poor visibility or enemy ground fire. Ground forces transmitted radio signals that aircrews homed on, ensuring supply delivery to correct locations even when visual identification was impossible. German transport aircraft lacked equivalent navigation aids, relying primarily on visual navigation and dead reckoning. This approach limited operations to good visibility conditions and required familiarity with terrain that wasn't available when supplying forces in unfamiliar territory. Allied navigation technology eliminated these constraints, enabling supply operations regardless of weather or terrain familiarity. The supply packaging innovations that Allied forces developed specifically for aerial delivery demonstrated systematic engineering addressing logistics challenges. American supply containers featured crushable honeycomb structures absorbing landing impacts, protecting contents while minimizing weight. Parachute systems employed quick-release mechanisms allowing ground forces to recover supplies rapidly. Color-coded containers enabled ground troops to identify contents without opening packages, facilitating efficient distribution. These packaging solutions represented industrial engineering addressing practical problems through systematic development and testing. Allied forces didn't improvise aerial supply methods. They engineered complete systems optimized for efficiency through iterative design processes. German supply operations relied on conventional packaging adapted for aerial delivery with limited effectiveness, reflecting lack of systematic engineering investment in logistics technology. The medical supply delivery that Allied aerial logistics enabled demonstrated life-saving capabilities beyond conventional logistics reach. Wounded paratroopers received blood plasma, antibiotics, and surgical supplies air-delivered to isolated units within hours of casualty occurrence. The rapid medical resupply reduced mortality rates significantly compared to conventional ground evacuation timelines. Allied forces could sustain combat operations in isolated positions partly because aerial logistics delivered medical supplies, maintaining unit effectiveness despite casualties. German medical logistics relied on ground evacuation to rear-area hospitals, with wounded soldiers requiring hours or days to reach definitive medical care. The delays increased mortality rates and reduced unit effectiveness as casualties accumulated without adequate field treatment. Allied aerial medical logistics provided operational advantages German conventional medical systems couldn't match, contributing to sustained combat effectiveness of isolated airborne forces. The fuel delivery that Allied aerial logistics achieved represented particularly impressive technical accomplishment. Fuel was heavy, bulky, and dangerous to air deliver, presenting extreme challenges for parachute delivery. Allied forces developed specialized containers that survived drops without rupturing, delivering aviation and vehicle fuel to isolated units. The capability enabled extended operations by mechanized forces operating beyond ground supply reach. German logistics officers considered aerial fuel delivery practically impossible due to fire, risks, and container weight penalties. The idea that Allied forces routinely delivered fuel by parachute seemed reckless to German planners accustomed to conservative logistics practices. Yet intelligence reports confirmed Allied forces were successfully air-delivering thousands of gallons of fuel, supporting isolated operations, demonstrating technical solutions to problems German engineers hadn't attempted solving. The Hayes artillery ammunition aerial delivery that Allied forces achieved shocked German artillery officers familiar with. Ammunition handling requirements. Artillery shells required careful handling, preventing detonation during transport and storage. Dropping artillery ammunition by parachute seemed impossibly dangerous, risking catastrophic explosions that would destroy supplies and kill ground personnel. Allied forces engineered ammunition containers that protected shells during parachute landing, enabling artillery resupply to isolated positions. The ABDC capability meant Allied airborne divisions operated with organic artillery, support maintained through aerial resupply rather than being forced to abandon heavy weapons after initial ammunition expenditure. German airborne doctrine assumed paratroopers would operate with limited artillery due to ammunition resupply impossibility. Allied technological solutions eliminated constraints German planners considered fundamental, enabling sustained artillery support for isolated forces. Major Hans Krieger, serving as supply officer for German forces defending against Market Garden, personally witnessed Allied aerial resupply operations, maintaining airborne divisions throughout sustained combat. Krieger watched transport aircraft flying repeated missions despite German anti-aircraft fire, delivering supplies to drop zones marked by colored smoke. The resupply operations continued day after day, maintaining Allied unit effectiveness throughout extended operation. Krieger calculated that Allied forces were delivering over 100 tons of supplies daily to isolated airborne units, matching theoretical requirements for division sustainment. The logistics achievement seemed impossible according to German doctrine, yet was occurring before his eyes. The evidence was undeniable, even if explanations remained professionally incomprehensible to logistics officers trained in conventional, ground-based supply systems. The air superiority that enabled Allied aerial logistics operations revealed strategic advantages extending beyond logistics to comprehensive operational dominance. Allied transport aircraft flew supply missions in daylight without prohibitive losses because Allied fighters controlled airspace, preventing German fighter interception. The aerial superiority that protected bombers also safeguarded logistics aircraft, enabling routine supply operations that would be suicidal without air dominance. German transport operations required fighter escort when operating near combat zones, consuming scarce fighter resources, protecting vulnerable logistics aircraft. Even with escort, German transport missions suffered high loss rates when encountering Allied air opposition. By 1944, German aerial logistics had become practically impossible in contested airspace, limiting supply operations to nighttime missions or areas where Allied air power wasn't present. The contrast highlighted comprehensive Allied advantages where tactical capabilities reinforced each other, creating multiplicative effects. Air superiority enabled strategic bombing, which destroyed German industrial capacity, which reduced German aircraft production, which prevented German air forces from contesting Allied air dominance, which enabled Allied aerial logistics operating freely. Each advantage reinforced others, creating virtuous cycles for Allied forces and death spirals. For German operations, the transport aircraft production statistics underlying Allied logistics capabilities shocked German intelligence officers when they obtained comprehensive data through captured documents and neutral intelligence sources. American factories had produced over 10,000 C-47 transport aircraft, plus thousands of C-46 heavy transports and specialized variants. British factories produced comparable numbers of equivalent aircraft. The total Allied transport fleet exceeded 20,000 aircraft by 1944, representing industrial output devoted to logistics aviation alone, exceeding Germany's entire military aircraft production. German transport aircraft production totaled approximately 3,000 Ju-52 aircraft throughout the war, with production declining after 1942 as resources were prioritized for fighters and bombers. The production disparity meant Allied forces possessed transport capacity exceeding German capability by factors of 7 or more. Explaining logistics operations, German resources couldn't replicate regardless of tactical doctrine or organizational efficiency. The maintenance infrastructure supporting Allied transport operations demonstrated industrial organization extending throughout logistics systems. American transport aircraft were maintained using standardized procedures, interchangeable parts, and systematic servicing schedules ensuring high availability rates. Transport units operated mobile maintenance facilities that accompanied deployed forces, providing field repair capabilities, maintaining operational readiness. German transport units struggled with maintenance difficulties, reducing aircraft availability below 50% during periods of intensive operations. Spare parts shortages kept aircraft grounded awaiting components. Maintenance procedures varied between units without standardized practices ensuring consistent quality. The operational inefficiencies compounded capacity limitations, meaning Germany's limited transport fleet operated at fractions of theoretical capacity due to maintenance problems. Allied systematic procedures avoided the aircrew rest and rotation policies that Allied forces employed, revealed personnel management understanding. The German operations often neglected. American transport crews operated on scheduled rotations, limiting consecutive mission days, ensuring adequate rest, preventing fatigue-related accidents. The systematic approach reduced accident rates while maintaining crew effectiveness throughout sustained operations. German transport operations pushed crews to exhaustion during intensive periods, accepting higher accident rates as unavoidable costs of operational necessity. The approach reflected resource scarcity, forcing German forces to extract maximum effort from limited personnel regardless of safety consequences. Allied personnel abundance enabled humane policies that maintained effectiveness while reducing unnecessary casualties. The supply distribution systems that ground forces employed to utilize air-delivered supplies revealed organizational sophistication coordinating aerial and ground logistics seamlessly. Allied airborne units operated supply collection teams that secured drop zones, recovered containers, distributed contents to combat units, and transmitted resupply requests to aerial logistics commanders. The systematic procedures ensured efficient utilization of air-delivered supplies, maximizing logistics effectiveness. German forces lacked equivalent distribution systems because they hadn't developed doctrine for receiving large-scale aerial resupply. When German units occasionally received airdrops, supplies were recovered haphazardly, with significant losses to disorganization and enemy action. The procedural differences meant Allied aerial logistics delivered supplies more effectively to their units than German ground logistics provided to theirs. The communication systems coordinating aerial logistics operations revealed technological capabilities enabling responsive supply delivery. Allied ground forces employed radio systems requesting specific supplies transmitted to air bases where logistics coordinators assembled loads matching requirements. Transport aircraft departed, carrying supplies requested by specific units, delivering tailored loads rather than standardized packages. The responsive logistics reduced waste while ensuring units received needed supplies quickly. German communication systems lacked capacity for such responsive coordination. Radio communications were unreliable, encoding procedures were cumbersome, and logistics commands lacked organizational structures for rapid response to frontline requests. German supply operations relied on pre-planned deliveries based on estimated requirements rather than responsive systems adjusting to actual needs. The inefficiency meant German units frequently received inadequate supplies or surpluses of unneeded items. The weather forecasting supporting Allied logistics operations demonstrated meteorological capabilities, enabling operational planning German services couldn't match. American weather forecasters provided detailed predictions, allowing logistics planners to schedule supply missions for periods with acceptable flying conditions. The forecasting accuracy reduced canceled missions and weather-related accidents, improving logistics efficiency significantly. German weather forecasting was less sophisticated, with limited data collection networks and less accurate prediction models. transport missions frequently encountered unexpected weather, causing mission failures or aircraft losses. The meteorological disadvantage compounded logistics difficulties, making German aerial supply unreliable even when aircraft and supplies were available. The night operations capabilities that Allied transport forces developed enabled round-the-clock logistics operations, maximizing delivery capacity. American transport pilots trained extensively in night flying, using instruments and radio navigation operating effectively in darkness. Night supply missions reduced aircraft vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire while allowing continuous resupply operations. German transport pilots received minimal night flying training, with night operations considered exceptionally hazardous and employed only in desperate circumstances. The capability gap meant Allied forces operated 24-hour logistics cycles, while German operations were limited to daylight or occasional hazardous night missions. The operational tempo advantages multiplied Allied logistics effectiveness beyond what aircraft numbers alone suggested. Major Werner Schultz, captured during the Ardennes offensive and interrogated about German logistics difficulties, described his shock upon learning that American forces routinely air-supplied divisions operating beyond conventional supply reach. Schultz had commanded supply operations for German armor and struggled constantly with fuel and ammunition shortages, despite units being located on established supply routes with intact road networks. American forces supplied isolated divisions by air more effectively than German ground logistics supplied conventional units. The strategic implications of Allied aerial logistics capabilities extended beyond operational sustainment to fundamental transformation of warfare possibilities. Traditional military doctrine assumed forces operating beyond conventional supply lines faced inevitable defeat through supply exhaustion. Allied aerial logistics eliminated this constraint, enabling operations deep behind enemy lines sustained indefinitely through air supply. The capability revolutionized operational planning, making possible strategic concepts impossible under conventional logistics limitations. The Berlin airlift that would occur in 1948-49, supplying an entire city through aerial logistics for over a year, represented the ultimate vindication of capabilities German officers had dismissed as impossible during the war. American and British transport aircraft delivered over 3 million tons of supplies to Berlin during the airlift, sustaining a city of 2 million inhabitants entirely through air transportation. The operation demonstrated that aerial logistics could support not just military units, but entire civilian populations, achieving what German logistics experts had considered theoretically impossible. German supply officers who witnessed or learned about the Berlin airlift experienced renewed psychological shock as they understood that wartime aerial logistics capabilities they had encountered represented sustainable technologies rather than temporary wartime expedients. The organizational systems, aircraft production, and operational procedures that enabled wartime supply operations continued functioning in peacetime, supporting humanitarian missions through capabilities German doctrine had never imagined. The helicopter introduction to military logistics during and after World War II represented another aerial supply innovation that German forces never developed despite having pioneered early helicopter technology. American forces employed helicopters for medical evacuation and small-scale resupply during late-war Pacific operations, demonstrating vertical takeoff aircraft could access locations impossible for conventional aircraft. The capability foreshadowed Korean and Vietnam War logistics, where helicopters became fundamental to supply operations. German helicopter development remained experimental throughout the war, despite early technical leads in rotary wing aviation. The Luftwaffe never deployed helicopters operationally because doctrine emphasized fixed-wing aircraft and resources couldn't support speculative technology development. Allied forces, with greater industrial capacity, could invest in emerging technologies that German resource scarcity prevented exploring. The pattern repeated across numerous technical domains, where Allied industrial abundance enabled innovation German constraints prevented. The container standardization that Allied forces employed for aerial supply represented organizational innovation, with implications extending beyond military logistics to post-war commercial containerization, revolutionizing global trade. American forces developed standardized container sizes, handling procedures, and cargo organization methods optimizing efficient loading, transport, and distribution. The systematic approach reduced handling time and improved cargo security compared to ad hoc packing methods. German supply operations used varied container sizes and packing methods without systematic standardization. The lack of coordination created inefficiencies where containers didn't fit efficiently in transport aircraft. Loading procedures varied between units, and cargo handling required excessive time. The organizational inefficiency compounded resource limitations, reducing effective logistics capacity below what equipment and personnel could theoretically achieve. The photographic reconnaissance that supported Allied supply operations revealed intelligence capabilities enabling precise logistics planning. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed drop zones before supply missions, identifying landing areas, obstacles, and enemy positions. Photo interpreters analyzed images providing detailed intelligence that logistics planners incorporated into mission planning, reducing risks and improving delivery accuracy. German reconnaissance capabilities were more limited due to aircraft shortages and film processing bottlenecks. Intelligence supporting logistics operations was often outdated or incomplete, forcing transport pilots to deliver supplies to inadequately reconnoitered drop zones. The information disadvantage increased mission risks and reduced delivery success rates, making German aerial logistics more dangerous and less effective than Allied equivalents. The radar technology that Allied forces employed for navigation and terrain avoidance enabled all-weather operations that German equipment couldn't match. American transport aircraft carried radar systems allowing pilots to navigate accurately and avoid terrain in poor visibility. The technology made supply operations feasible in weather conditions that would ground German aircraft dependent on visual navigation. German radar development prioritized air defense and targeting applications over navigation aids for transport aircraft. The doctrinal emphasis reflected assumptions that logistics aviation was secondary priority compared to combat systems. The prioritization decisions meant German transport capabilities remained constrained by technological limitations that Allied forces overcame through systematic radar deployment. The industrial mobilization that enabled Allied logistics superiority reflected economic systems producing military equipment at scales German industry never approached. American factories operated at full capacity throughout the war, converting from civilian to military production while simultaneously expanding total industrial output. The dual achievement of conversion and expansion meant American military production increased dramatically while civilian economies continued functioning. German industry operated under constant resource constraints, forcing trade-offs between competing military priorities and minimal civilian needs. Logistics equipment competed with weapons production for scarce resources, with weapons usually prioritized. The allocation decisions meant German logistics never received resources necessary for capabilities Allied forces developed systematically, creating permanent disadvantages no tactical excellence could overcome. The labor force differences supporting Allied versus German industry explained much of the production disparity. American industry employed millions of workers in war production while maintaining agricultural and civilian sectors. Women entered industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, with Rosie the Riveter symbolizing expanded labor participation that multiplied available industrial capacity. The labor mobilization enabled production scaling German forced labor systems never achieved. German industry relied increasingly on forced laborers from occupied territories and concentration camps, with coerced workers providing minimal productivity compared to voluntary American workforces. The combination of inadequate labor supply and poor motivation created productivity gaps that compounded resource shortages, ensuring German production never approached Allied output regardless of technical capabilities or organizational efforts. The petroleum resources supporting Allied logistics operations provided fundamental advantages German synthetic fuel programs never overcame. American petroleum production exceeded 1.5 billion barrels annually, providing unlimited fuel for military operations including transport aviation, consuming tens of millions of gallons monthly. Allied forces never faced fuel constraints limiting logistics operations, operating transport fleets without conservation concerns. German aviation fuel shortages became critical constraints by 1944, with allocations prioritized for combat aircraft, while transport operations received minimal allotments. The fuel scarcity made German aerial logistics impractical regardless of aircraft availability or operational requirements. German transport aircraft sat grounded not from lack of planes or crews, but from empty fuel tanks, rendering theoretical capabilities operationally useless. The training infrastructure supporting Allied logistics operations demonstrated educational systems producing qualified personnel at scales German training never achieved. American logistics schools trained tens of thousands of supply specialists, cargo handlers, and logistics planners using standardized curricula. The systematic training created professional logistics corps with specialized expertise, enabling complex operations German improvised logistics couldn't replicate. German logistics personnel received minimal formal training, learning duties through apprenticeship and on-job experience. The informal approach worked adequately in peacetime, but couldn't scale to wartime requirements for rapidly trained personnel. German logistics operations suffered chronic quality problems, reflecting inadequate training systems that Allied formal schools avoided through systematic instruction. The statistical analysis that Allied logistics commands employed revealed organizational sophistication using data-driven decision-making. American supply officers tracked delivery success rates, aircraft utilization, fuel consumption, and cargo efficiency through systematic record-keeping. The data analysis identified bottlenecks, optimized procedures, and improved operations through continuous refinement based on measured performance. German logistics operated without equivalent statistical tracking, relying on commanders' subjective assessments rather than systematic data collection. The lack of metrics prevented identifying inefficiencies or measuring improvement efforts. German logistics never knew precisely how effectively systems operated, making optimization impossible and allowing problems to persist unrecognized. The interoperability that Allied logistics achieved between American and British forces demonstrated coordination capabilities German forces never developed with their own allies. American and British transport aircraft operated from each other's air bases, delivered supplies to Allied units, and coordinated missions through integrated planning. The seamless cooperation multiplied effective logistics capacity through resource sharing German and Italian forces never approached. German cooperation with Italian and other Axis forces remained limited by language barriers, incompatible equipment, and mutual distrust. German forces rarely provided logistics support to Allied units, operating separate supply systems even when cooperating operationally. The lack of integration reduced effective Axis logistics capacity compared to coordinated Allied operations. The post-surrender evaluations that German logistics officers conducted confirmed comprehensive Allied advantages across every logistics dimension. Allied forces possessed more aircraft, better trained crews, superior navigation technology, more efficient organization, adequate fuel, systematic training, and industrial capacity supporting sustained operations. German logistics suffered disadvantages in every category, creating cumulative inferiority no tactical innovations could overcome. General Major Walter Warlimont, Wehrmacht operations staff officer, acknowledged during post-war interrogations that German forces lost the war partly through logistics failures rather than purely tactical defeats. German units possessed adequate weapons and well-trained soldiers, but couldn't maintain operations because supplies didn't reach front lines consistently. Allied logistics maintained unit effectiveness throughout sustained campaigns, while German supply failures created operational collapses. The psychological transformation of German supply officers from confidence to horror paralleled broader recognition that Germany had challenged industrial powers whose organizational and material capabilities exceeded German capacity across every dimension. The specific shock of witnessing Allied aerial logistics operating at impossible scales represented one manifestation of comprehensive disadvantages German forces faced throughout the war. Oberst Richter's final assessment, written in American Captivity during June 1945, acknowledged that German logistics doctrine had been comprehensively defeated by Allied capabilities German expertise never anticipated. The professional assumptions that seemed self-evident during peacetime proved inadequate for industrial warfare, where organizational efficiency and material abundance determined outcomes more than tactical proficiency or individual excellence. The legacy of Allied aerial logistics innovations extended throughout post-war military development, with all major powers adopting systematic airlift capabilities. Modern military doctrine assumes aerial resupply as fundamental capability rather than specialized technique, reflecting universal recognition that air logistics enable operational flexibility conventional ground supply cannot match. The transformation from skepticism to universal adoption vindicated wartime American investments that German experts dismissed as wasteful. The commercial aviation expansion that revolutionized global transportation traced direct lineage to military airlift capabilities developed during World War II. Airlines adopted cargo operations using surplus military transport aircraft, applying logistics techniques developed for military supply to commercial freight. The global air cargo industry that emerged during the 1950s and 1960s utilized organizational systems and operational procedures pioneered by wartime military logistics. The humanitarian relief operations that became routine during post-war decades relied fundamentally on aerial logistics capabilities developed during World War II. 2. Natural disaster response, famine relief, and emergency medical supply all employed. Air transportation delivering assistance to inaccessible regions. The capability to sustain isolated populations through aerial supply, which German officers considered impossible, became standard humanitarian practice. The space program logistics that enabled lunar missions during the 1960s represented ultimate extension of systematic supply planning developed during World War II. NASA supply operations coordinating thousands of components delivered to launch facilities on precise schedules reflected organizational approaches pioneered by military logistics planners. The technical complexity differed, but organizational principles remained consistent with wartime logistics innovation. The just-in-time manufacturing that revolutionized industrial production during the 1980s incorporated supply chain management concepts developed during World War II. 2. Coordinating component delivery to manufacturing facilities, minimizing inventory. Costs reflected logistics. Optimization techniques, military planners developed ensuring efficient supply flow. Modern industrial logistics descended directly from wartime innovation that German officers witnessed with horror during 1944-45. The bewilderment and horror that German supply officers experienced when confronting Allied aerial logistics capabilities reflected professional assumptions shattered by encountering capabilities exceeding theoretical expectations. The officers who dismissed aerial supply as impossible learned through devastating experience that organizational innovation and industrial capacity could achieve what conventional doctrine considered unfeasible. The transformation from dismissive certainty to horrified comprehension paralleled broader German recognition that they had challenged nations whose industrial and organizational capabilities exceeded German capacity systematically. The specific shock of aerial logistics represented one manifestation of comprehensive disadvantages, ensuring German defeat regardless of tactical excellence or individual courage. The psychological journey from confidence to horror shaped post-war German logistics thinking, with former Wehrmacht officers carrying painful lessons about organizational efficiency and industrial capacity into reconstruction efforts. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany during the 1950s incorporated logistics lessons learned through wartime defeat, emphasizing systematic organization, statistical analysis, and industrial efficiency that German wartime logistics had lacked. The strategic mobility that aerial logistics provided Allied forces represented paradigm shift in military capabilities, enabling rapid force projection across global distances. American forces demonstrated ability to deploy divisions to distant theaters, sustain them through aerial supply during initial phases, and transition to conventional logistics once ground infrastructure was established. The capability enabled global operations German forces constrained by conventional logistics could never achieve. German military doctrine assumed logistics dictated operational possibilities, with forces limited to objectives within supply line reach. This assumption shaped strategic planning, emphasizing sequential operations where each phase established logistics infrastructure supporting subsequent advances. The methodical approach worked when facing opponents with equivalent logistics constraints, but failed against enemies whose aerial logistics eliminated conventional limitations. Allied forces operated without equivalent constraints, conducting simultaneous operations across multiple theaters sustained through aerial supply until ground logistics caught up. The capability enabled strategic flexibility German sequential operations couldn't match, allowing Allied forces to maintain initiative and force German responses across fronts exceeding German logistics capacity to support adequately. The technological evolution from World War II aerial logistics to modern strategic airlift demonstrated continuous development building on wartime innovations. The C-47 that shocked German officers through its capabilities evolved into C-130, Hercules, C-141 Starlifter, and C-17 Globemaster aircraft, delivering larger payloads over greater distances with higher reliability. Each generation incorporated lessons learned from previous operations, systematically improving capabilities while maintaining organizational continuity. German logistics development during post-war reconstruction emphasized ground transportation, systems consistent with traditional doctrine rather than investing heavily in aerial logistics. The Bundeswehr that emerged during the 1950s operated minimal airlift capabilities, depending on NATO allies for strategic transport. The doctrinal conservatism reflected institutional memory of wartime trauma, where aerial logistics innovations German forces encountered proved devastating and incomprehensible. The paradox was that Germany, having witnessed Allied aerial logistics superiority firsthand, failed to adopt equivalent capabilities during reconstruction. The psychological impact of wartime defeat appeared to reinforce traditional logistics doctrine rather than inspiring innovation matching Allied capabilities. Former Wehrmacht officers building the Bundeswehr remained skeptical of aerial logistics despite witnessing its effectiveness, preferring familiar ground-based systems over technologies that had defeated them. The contrast with American logistics development was stark. American forces that had demonstrated aerial supply capabilities during World War II continued systematic investment in airlift technology throughout the Cold War. The institutional confidence that came from successful innovation encouraged continued development, creating a virtuous cycle where capabilities enabled ambitious operations that justified further investment in logistics improvement. The organizational culture differences that enabled American logistics innovation versus German conservatism reflected broader national characteristics shaping military development. American military culture encouraged innovation and accepted failure as learning opportunity. Officers proposing novel approaches received support testing concepts, even if initial results were disappointing. The tolerance for experimentation enabled breakthrough innovations that more conservative systems suppressed. German military culture emphasized proven methods and viewed innovation skeptically unless thoroughly validated. Officers proposing unconventional approaches faced institutional resistance, requiring extensive justification before receiving resources for testing. The conservative culture prevented wasteful experiments, but also suppressed innovations that might provide decisive advantages, creating risk-averse systems that avoided both spectacular failures and breakthrough successes. The educational systems that shaped American versus German logistics officers reflected these cultural differences. American military schools emphasized problem-solving and encouraged students questioning established doctrine. Case studies analyzed failures as well as successes, extracting lessons from mistakes rather than simply celebrating victories. The educational approach developed officers capable of innovation rather than merely executing established procedures. German military education emphasized mastery of doctrine and proper execution of established procedures. Students learned correct methods for standard situations rather than developing adaptive thinking for novel problems. The approach produced technically proficient officers who excelled at conventional operations but struggled adapting to unexpected circumstances, requiring innovation beyond doctrinal frameworks. The legacy lessons from German supply officers, horror at Allied aerial logistics, extend beyond specific technical capabilities to fundamental principles about military innovation, organizational culture, and strategic thinking. Superior doctrine or better trained personnel cannot overcome systematic disadvantages in resources, technology, and organizational efficiency. Tactical excellence provides limited advantages when opponents possess overwhelming material and organizational superiority. The bewilderment German officers experienced reflected intellectual frameworks inadequate for comprehending industrial warfare, where production capacity and organizational scale determined outcomes. The professional expertise that seemed comprehensive during peacetime proved incomplete when confronting enemies who approached warfare through different paradigms, emphasizing industrial production, systematic organization, and technological innovation over traditional military excellence. The horror came from recognizing not just that Allied forces possessed superior capabilities, but that those capabilities reflected systematic advantages German forces couldn't replicate through any realistic efforts. The aircraft production, fuel availability, pilot training, and organizational sophistication underlying Allied aerial logistics represented industrial and institutional capabilities years of German development couldn't match. The recognition that Germany had challenged opponents whose fundamental capacities exceeded German potential was psychologically devastating. The story of German supply officers being horrified when Americans airdropped entire divisions represents more than logistics innovation comparison. It demonstrates how organizational capabilities and industrial capacity can achieve the impossible according to conventional doctrine, how professional assumptions can blind experts to emerging possibilities, and how comprehensive systematic advantages across multiple dimensions create multiplicative effects, ensuring decisive superiority. The transformation from confident dismissal to horrified comprehension shaped generations of logistics thinking, with lessons extending far beyond World War II to modern military logistics, emphasizing flexibility, innovation, and systematic capability development. The officers who experienced this transformation carried knowledge that technological and organizational innovation could revolutionize warfare in ways traditional doctrine never anticipated. Lessons that remain relevant for contemporary military development. The aerial logistics capabilities that seemed impossible to German experts in 1944 became routine practice for modern militaries, with strategic airlift considered fundamental capability rather than specialized technique. The impossibility that German doctrine assumed was overcome through systematic innovation, industrial capacity, and organizational determination, demonstrating that human ingenuity and industrial capability can achieve what theory suggests is unfeasible. The horror German officers experienced witnessing this achievement stands as permanent testimony to the revolutionary power of systematic innovation combined with adequate resources and determined execution.